Okay, welcome back, everybody. I think we better get started as we have quite a tight schedule. My name is Manon Parry. I'm a historian of medicine, and I'm co-organizer of this conference. And just before we start, I'd like to give a special thank you to Cecile Ondersteger, who really has done the bulk of the work to bring this fantastic group of people here today. I was thrilled to have an opportunity to reach out to some historians whose work I've been interested in, but it's really wonderful to be able to put their work in conversation with so much interesting activity going on from across the field of health professionals and activists and service organizations and community organizations. So sincere thanks to you, Cecile, for bringing that opportunity for us all. And I'm going to move on. Yeah, thank you. But I shall move swiftly on to our keynote speaker for today's session. I'd like to welcome Dr. Ian Marsh, who is the Suicide Safer Project Lead and Reader at the School of Allied and Public Health Professions in the Faculty of Medicine, Health and Social Care at Canterbury Christ Church University in the UK. And he's going to be speaking today about describing and redescribing suicide from pathology to questions of social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Manon. Thank you, Cecile, for inviting me to the conference. It's been fantastic so far. Really, really interesting. Okay, I'm going to talk. I've actually written a paper. I don't usually do that, so I'm going to try and read that. It might be a little bit long, so I'm going to end up speeding up. But if it's too fast, will you tell me? And I'll try and slow down. But what I will say, that's not because of your English. And as I always find every time I go to the Netherlands, people speak English better in the Netherlands than they do in England by quite a lot. so very, very impressive. Okay, I'll just locate myself a little bit, if you can follow this. On the top left, as you're looking at it, that's a health centre in Faversham. I worked there for about 10 years in community mental health as an occupational therapist. I think, do you have occupational therapists? Yeah. Do they work in mental health in Holland? Oh, excellent. Okay, that's what I did. I did that for a long time. And when I worked there, I had a caseload of about 55, 60, I remember. And I remember being very tired and having to work very hard. But I remember enjoying my work a lot. But I worked with quite a lot of people who talked about wanting to end their life by suicide. And what kind of struck me when I was working with people over this 10-year period of time was that people's description of their own kind of thoughts around suicide and the reasons why they were thinking about suicide didn't fit very well with the kind of reasoning and the way we framed it as a mental health team. We kind of had a very, I think, reductionist kind of medicalized view of suicide that didn't really fit that well with the descriptions of the people I was working with. And it bothered me, and it bothered me quite a lot. And it bothered me mostly because there was a friend I was living with, and his brother died by suicide. And his brother was a service user, a patient under the team I was working. And he had lots of kind of issues, but they weren't all mental health issues. A lot of them were kind of broader than that. And yet when we talked about his death as a team, it was kind of very much conceptualized as this was to do with his mental health and what was going on in his head. And it bothered me enough for me want to do some research around it. So that's what I did. And when I was doing some research for a PhD, I kind of came across some critical theory, and part of that was kind of critical history. So I'm going to try and talk about that a bit today. When I finished my PhD, it got published, which was good. It was nice to be published. But it also meant it got published around the world. So part of the outcome or unintended consequence, in a way, of doing that research was it puts me in touch with lots of people around the world that were also thinking about suicide from a kind of critical perspective. Okay, so there's people like people that have lived experience of suicide and bereavement by suicide, but also people that have kind of studying politics, social justice activists, indigenous peoples, narrative therapists, critical queer theorists, anthropologists, lots of people outside the mainstream of suicide prevention were also thinking about suicide and didn't feel like they had a place within mainstream suicide prevention. So we set up our own network. So we have this critical suicide studies network that we work with. And we've looked at kind of what is critical suicidology, what is, if you think about suicide as a kind of social justice issue rather as a mental health issue, what are the consequences of that? And that's what I try and unpack a little bit in my paper. I also do research which is, I think, probably more mainstream for, mostly it's been around methods. So I've actually worked a little bit with the Dutch railways as well as the ones in the UK. around preventing suicide on railways, also with the national highways, and East Sussex is a coastal area where there's a cliff, there's high rates. So I also do research around suicide in public places and specific methods, and I might talk a little about this. Okay, I'm going to start reading, and just wave at me or shout if it's too fast or it doesn't make sense. Yeah, okay. Well, maybe not every line, maybe occasionally shout at me if it doesn't make sense. Okay. In this paper, I will briefly outline a history of thought and practice in relation to suicide since the late 19th century and reflect on how an understanding of that history might form a ground for a critical history of the present in relation to suicide. I will then look at critiques of current ways of understanding and responding to suicide, put forward by the Critical Suicide Studies Network, and how these might open up spaces for thinking about suicide in alternative ways. As an example of this, I will outline what a political or social justice approach to suicide might look like, and discuss how this approach could offer possibilities for new ways of approaching the issue. I would also outline critiques of suicide prevention practices that focus on suicidism, the notion that suicidal people experience marginalisation and oppression due to their desire to die. And I think there's been some really interesting work recently calling into question the notion of prevention as necessarily the correct approach when working with suicidal people, that maybe we need to kind of critique prevention itself as an idea. And if I have time, I'll talk about that. Okay, so if we trace a history of suicide from about 1880 to the present day in terms of thought and practices, it has arguably been dominated by what I call a compulsory ontology of pathology. That is, we have come to think about suicide largely in terms of individual mental illness and practices of risk assessment and management, diagnosis, treatment, confinement, observation, and restraint within medical psychiatric spaces, such as psychiatric hospitals and mental health units, and formerly asylums. And these have come to be naturalised as necessary and effective responses, with prevention as the guiding principle. The emergence and development of this medical psychiatric style of thought in the 19th century can be read in terms of the formation of a particular regime of truth in relation to suicide, one centering on an understanding of suicide as arising as a consequence of individual pathology. Although other views, philosophical, moral and religious, continue to be aired and the process of medicalisation piecemeal and complex, it is this thought style and related practices, confinement, constant watching, restraint, etc., that come to dominate over the next century or more up until the present. This particular regime of truth has undoubtedly opened up possibilities for understanding and managing self-destructive thoughts, desires and acts, but equally it is also troublesome in terms of its assumptions and effects. And I think an individualized, internalized, pathologized, depoliticized, and ultimately tragic form of suicide has come to be produced with, I believe, alternative and potentially more useful interpretations of acts of self-accomplished death, marginalized or foreclosed. So these discursive practices, it's a diagram, you kind of, it's what Foucault would call a kind of dispositif or an assemblage, how it kind of works together, discourses, what gets done, and the kind of institutions that kind of dominate certain ways of managing social problems. So these discursive practices position suicidal individuals as almost invariably mentally unwell, and thus not fully responsible for their actions. Instead, clinicians are taken to be the responsible, accountable, and possible culpable agents in relation to the suicide of a patient. And that's the other thing when I worked in mental health services, when I did, is that the day I finished working in mental health services and went into university, I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders, because I think that constant anxiety about the death of a suicide and being held accountable for that is very anxiety-provoking for clinicians, I think. And I think this underemphasizing of the agency of the people with a desire to die and the concomitant overstating of the agency and reach of mental health staff serves neither well nor fairly. In my experience, this often creates tensions, anxieties, and an aversion to or a detached acceptance of risk for staff, and a sense of powerlessness and a lack of validation of their desires and actions for those who are suicidal. Whilst not ignoring or discounting the often supportive and life-saving work that does occur within a structure, relationships can also emerge which are oppositional and distrustful. So I think it's problematic how kind of we end up having to relate as mental health clinicians to suicidal people within this kind of assemblage, if you like. So thinking about critical history, how might history kind of help us unravel this a little bit? Whilst there is undoubtedly coherence and logic to what we could call a mental health approach to suicide, and it provides a compelling narrative to many, its dominance and the assumptions embedded within it are somewhat problematic. So how might history be of use to opening up the topic so that alternative, potentially more useful understandings can arise? Criticising dominant forms of thought can be difficult. Strong normative forces can be at work, and the vocabulary and concepts we draw upon are often more constraining and liberating. So written through are they with accepted meanings. The truths of suicide as an act of pathology are often forcibly set out and defended, are embedded in authoritative texts such as national suicide prevention strategies, WHO guidance, research published in the main journals, guidelines for media reporting, and campaigns such as those around zero suicide. But I think it's perhaps here that history can be utilised to call into question the presumed naturalness, inevitability, and usefulness of such views. And for me, I found the work of Michel Foucault quite useful. And I think for Foucault, historical analysis needs to follow certain principles in order to function as a form of critique. And I think if we think about the history of suicide, following some of these principles, it opens up space for other ways of thinking. So I think his studies were guided by a consistent anti-essentialism, particularly in relation to questions of human nature, a skepticism towards all anthropological universals, indeed to all universals, was a necessity if history was to have a critical function. When related to suicide, such a history would have to be resistant to grounding its analysis in terms of either an invariant object, that is, the assumption of essential or universal features of suicide, which when I think about all the research that's published around suicide, recent history, there often is this search for kind of universal models or models that seek to explain all suicides. I think one thing I've learned 30 odd years studying suicide is that suicidal people aren't a homogenous group. It's actually really quite diverse, and the idea that you can find common features or a one theory or model that kind of encompasses that wide range of people, I don't think is going to work. So in place of suicide as an unchanging object of study, a critical history would look to establish such an object as an historical and cultural formation. So you move from suicide as something that's unchanging over time to something that does change over time. This is a terrible diagram, and I don't expect you to look at it and make any sense of it. It's something I did for myself when I was doing a PhD and writing something. It would probably give you a headache, actually, or a stroke looking at it. But what it is, it's just about the contingency of suicide, that the fact that it's not an invariant object, that it's something that has changed quite dramatically, actually, over time. And there's these kind of discontinuities that kind of open up suicide to being reformulated in different ways. And I think it's not just in terms of the concepts that kind of change. So we can think about it as a sin and a crime, and that kind of pathologization. 101 years ago, Esquirol, 1821. You can see there was kind of discontinuities. And this makes me think that it's actually a contingent, there's kind of historical contingencies about how we think about suicide. And when we kind of reframe it or redescribe it, suicide becomes something quite different, not just in terms of the kind of authoritative kind of discourses, the experts' kind of views, but also as an experience for suicidal people. And I think that's something we kind of forget, that it, like when it was a sin and crime, I think suicide was very different and very, very different for people who are also feeling suicidal or bereaved by suicide than it would be under a kind of medical kind of framing of it. Yeah, and okay, I'll skip this bit a little bit, but I think, and again, the other thing I think is interesting about that kind of medicalisation, that early 19th century medicalisation, is I don't think it was based on science. It was framed in kind of scientific, kind of medical kind of discourse and drawing on that vocabulary. But the kind of initial kind of theorising about, we should now think about suicide in kind of medical terms and medics should be expert, was a kind of it wasn't based on findings. It wasn't based on evidence of kind of pathology. It was based on a kind of fairly loose theorising. So initially it was around kind of that there was an organ of suicide that had become diseased, or that it was kind of in the viscera, the stomach, that we'd find kind of evidence of pathology, and that's why people were looking at to end their lives by suicide. Later on, people started talking about diseased instincts, and that the instinct of self-preservation had become kind of diseased. So throughout the kind of 19th century, it wasn't as if it was led by science. It wasn't as if there was kind of evidence that, this is absolutely right, this is the right way to kind of approach suicide because we are finding evidence of pathology. It was kind of the pathology was a hook to hang a kind of set of practices around, which was to do with kind of confinement and restraint. That was effective and did lots of things, but it kind of wasn't evidence-led despite what kind of claims are made. Sorry. Is this making sense? Not too fast? It's okay, good. It's a bit, what's that? A bit too fast. Okay, I will slow down. I talk fast anyway, I can't help it. I will try. So Heidi Helmeland is a friend of mine, she's a suicide researcher. She always tells me off. She says, not everyone's English is the first language. She's right. Okay. So I think, I will skip that bit. Let's talk about critical suicide studies, because I think that's interesting. Understanding these processes and the wider cultural, social, and political forces that constitute and shape suicide and the experiences of suicidal people has been at the forefront of the efforts of many scholars, activists, and clinicians to reimagine suicide and suicide prevention this last decade. So it's people that have found that kind of medical framing of suicide problematic, have looked at other ways, have kind of critiqued that, and then looked at other ways to kind of think about the subject. As a response to the assumptions and practices of mainstream or traditional suicidology, a critical suicidology, or now critical suicide studies, emerged during the 2010s. The main impetus for the movement was frustration at limited and limiting approaches to theory, most psychological or psychiatric-based theories, which focus on individual psychology and behaviour in isolation. Research approaches, kind of critiquing those, a hierarchy of evidence, prioritising quantitative and positive approaches over qualitative and lived experience ones, and practices, an almost exclusive focus on prevention, most often through the detection and treatment of mental illness, which has dominated the field. Louder. Slower and louder. Okay. I shall channel, who shall I channel? Laurence Olivier. The field of critical suicide study, it's good to get instant feedback. Students just usually get on their phones and stop listening. The field of critical suicide studies looks not just to critique the limitations of dominant quantitative, positivist and pathologizing approaches, but to move beyond that to construct alternative readings and descriptions of suicide and to develop congruent ethical research and clinical practices. A broader disciplinary base, looking to the humanities and social sciences, not just the side disciplines, and collaboration with people with lived experiences and from marginalised communities are taken to be both an ethical and practical necessity within critical suicide studies. However, the aim has not been merely to develop alternative descriptions of suicide within current accepted parameters, most usually those involving a focus on individual mental health risk factors, causation and prevention, but to explore what understandings of and responses to suicide can be constructed within an expanded framework which doesn't take current notions and practices of prevention to necessarily be the best approach to understanding, supporting and working with people with a desire to die. And one of those kind of approaches that we've kind of explored as a network is thinking about suicide as a political or a social justice issue rather than just as a mental health issue. So it's such a focus on the historical and cultural formation of suicidal subjectivity. So not taking suicidal people as being an unchanging object you can study and get exact knowledge of, but taking kind of suicide as actually a cultural project, a product that each age and kind of society produces its own kind of types of suicide. If you take that as a starting point, then that creates possibilities for exploring what could be considered the politics of suicide. Mark Button frames these as involving both the interrogation of the cultural scripts that sustain a punitive model of human agency, so how people come to view themselves within those kind of regimes, as well as addressing the material institutional conditions that prevent a dignified form of reciprocal social care from forming. I just unpacked the second one a little bit. So the second one opens up consideration of what a social justice approach to suicide would look like, a move away from psychocentric, as in, centering the psyche as the main issue, from psychocentric understandings, the reduction of human problems to flaws in individual body minds, of suicide, to approaches which centre more on questions of exclusion and oppression, politics, stigma, relations of power, and hate. A social justice approach moves beyond traditional sociological or social determinants of health perspectives. For while a relationship between suicide and various forms of social disadvantage and marginalisation has been long recognised by researchers, a social justice approach posits that behind these issues and inequalities are also socio-political drivers or forces, including colonialism, racism, heteronormativity, patriarchy, and downward economic mobility, that also influence patterns and rates of suicide around the world. These social facts of suicide tell a political story, a story or a series of stories that is frequently punctuated by marginalisation, persistent public policy neglect, cultivated indifference, and bad faith. And the basic question is, how come we don't think about suicide as a political issue? What kind of forces are behind that? So given that social facts of suicide have been long established, we can legitimately ask why is it that a more explicitly political and social structural narrative around suicide has not previously emerged? Or put another way, why it is that knowledge of the relationship between various dimensions of inequality and suicide has not led to a more organised or systematic political response within global suicide prevention efforts. And one answer, which I've argued, is that for nearly 2 centuries, the dominant way of framing the issue has been as an individual mental health problem. And this has strongly shaped the ways in which suicide is conceptualised and responded to in practice. So I think that individualising, that kind of responsibilisation of individuals around their mental health and framing the issue of suicide as an individual mental health problem has actually prevented us from actually addressing some of the structural and systematic and systemic kind of issues that lie behind suicide. So a social justice approach seeks to understand, am I nearly at the, where am I? Where's Manon? Am I okay?
You've got about 8 minutes.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Should be right. A social justice approach seeks to understand the complex interactions between various social pathologies, inequality, intergenerational poverty, racism, sexism, heteronormativity, marginalisation, stigma and social isolation, and individual or group experiences with suicidality. As such, a social justice approach to suicide requires that scholars, policymakers and practitioners investigate the underlying and often overlooked connections that link the rising rates and disproportionate concentrations of suicide within specific populations to the wider social, political and economic conditions bearing on individual lives. And it's quite interesting, Bert, talking about the 2008 financial crash, because I know in the UK, in the 2 years after the financial crash, there was over 1,000 more than expected suicides within the UK population. And they were concentrated in areas of deprivation and where there was most debt. So I think even kind of empirically, from an epistemological framework, you can begin to map and see that suicide isn't equally distributed. And when you look in fine-grained kind of detail, you can find that that is often to do with inequalities. Okay. I shall now talk about suicidism, because I think that's interesting. Oh, I'll just quickly talk about China Mills's work, actually. This is one kind of version of a kind of psychopolitical approach or a social justice approach to suicide. And her work deals with deaths in relation to the welfare or benefit system in the UK. So there's been lots of deaths. We've decided in the UK to create a hostile environment around benefit claimants. And one of her arguments, just really simply, is that we talk about thwarted belongingness and burdensomeness. You know, Thomas Joyner's model, someone had it, you had it up earlier, when you look at kind of burdensomeness. But do we ask the question about how do we create that sense of burden that people experience? And you look at the welfare system and the hostile environment around it, and the newspaper discourses. We have some very right-wing newspapers that talk about scroungers, that talk about people illegally claiming benefits, being a drain on society. And then is it any wonder that people internalise that and experience a sense of burdensomeness? But when you read it as a psychological problem, that kind of burdensomeness, we don't address the environments we create where suicide becomes more likely and some people become more at risk. And what China's Mills's work has done, I think brilliantly, is kind of make those links between social structures and hierarchies, the kind of what she calls the moral economies of human worth, you know, who we value and who we don't value and who we actively devalue. policy making, like around the welfare system, and actually then you get into the kind of emotional, psychological kind of lives of people, often around experiences of shame and anxiety and deaths by suicide. But it's a top bit also we need to think about. Okay, last bit, so there's just a couple of quotes I quite like. Vicky Renner's article is fantastic about hate kills. That's just about belonging. And then the Paul Farmer one, which I think is good. Okay, last few minutes I'll talk about suicidism. A further challenge to dominant ways of thinking and responding to suicide, and another potentially fruitful area of critical historical work, is the idea, most recently articulated by Saartjie Tagg and Alexandra Beryl, that the notion of suicide prevention itself is problematic. As previously noted, constructing accounts of suicide and suicidality that run counter to the prevailing prevention narrative and accepted social cultural norms around such experiences, desires and forms of death is challenging. As Saartjie Tagg argues, prevention is constructed as the prediscursive truth of suicide outside the realm of what can be questioned, and thus it can be difficult to find acceptable language with which to articulate alternative, such as pro-choice perspectives. Indeed, such is the dominance of the prevention imperative that it can even be hard to grasp what possibilities for thought and action exist outside of its reach. These difficulties are faced by researchers, but also surely more acutely by those experiencing such a desire to die, who are routinely taken to be irrational and other. For Beryl, the silencing and marginalisation of the views and experiences of suicidal people and a lack of access to the theoretical tools needed to understand and explain the oppression they experience represents forms of violence and injustice, which he names suicidism. Drawing on Miranda Fricker's notions of testimonial and hermeneutical injustice, Beryl argues that the judgment of suicidal people as irrational, incompetent, illegitimate or alienated destroys the credibility of suicidal subjects and invalidates their voices. Prevention approaches that rest on notions of irrationality and pathology as explanations for suicide, it is argued, often seem to fail to meet the needs of many people in crisis and distress, or those who live with chronic suicidality. For Beryl, a solution of sorts and a kind of bridge between prevention, acceptance or validation of a desire to die is suicide affirmative healthcare. Here, a non-coercive approach is advocated, one that would offer care and support through an informed consent model, taken for granted that the expert in a decision to transition, in this case from life to death, is the person making a decision. It goes without, this is a quote, sorry, from Alexandra Beryl. It goes without saying that before implementing this approach, it would be important to engage in extensive critical reflection regarding the conditions, regulations, safeguards, and type of accompaniment, as well as the simultaneous social political changes necessary to reduce suicidal ideations. These concrete aspects of a harm reduction approach would have to be determined primarily by and for suicidal people and their allies, mobilising their expertise on suicidality. So what Alexandra Beryl is advocating is quite a radical shift in terms of power, really, and in terms of who are the experts around suicide. And it raises lots of ethical questions, which I won't go into completely here. Okay, I'll get to my conclusions, and then am I all right time? Yeah. Okay, I like this quote from Judith Butler because I think it kind of sums up a little bit about how we end up in these situations where particular ways of thinking kind of dominate. As Judith Butler notes, certain kinds of practices which are designed to handle certain kinds of problems produce, over time, a settled domain of ontology as their consequence. And this ontological domain, in turn, constrains our understanding of what is possible. This is a case, I believe, with suicidology, where the 19th century medicalization of suicide and the introduction of medical psychiatric practices, identification, diagnosis, treatment of cases in a medical setting, the theorizing, the relationship between various and contingent categories of pathology and suicide, and forms of inquiry, mostly epidemiological studies and case studies, have led to a settled, but I think problematic, domain of ontology. Medical scientific discourse has undoubtedly been productive in terms of generating theories, monographs, conferences, etc. But it also limits and restricts to a troublesome degree what can be authoritatively said and done in relation to the issue of suicide. Deaths from suicide have come to be understood as private individual events, largely divorced from social, cultural and political contexts. that is, issues of social justice, practices of exclusion and oppression, politics, stigma, and relations of power. So I think tracing the histories of current dominant thought and practices can help us to understand that our current understandings of suicide and approaches to prevention are based on culturally and historically situated assumptions and notions, for instance of agency and personhood, as well as what constitutes illness and rationality. Understanding the contingency of contemporary constructions of suicide allows us to shift our focus in attempts to make sense of such acts, as well as responding to people experiencing a desire to die. By drawing on diverse and multiple discourses in thoughtful and creative ways, we might begin to construct alternative understandings of and responses to suicide that bring to the forefront social, political and ethical questions largely absent when suicide is constructed solely as a consequence of individual pathology. Last paragraph. Work explicitly linking suicide to issues of injustice, inequality, exclusion and oppression have more recently emerged out of the Critical Suicide Studies Network, constituting what we call a social, political, social justice approach to suicide. Such a process of redescription is also happening in relation to discourses of prevention and the ways in which people with a desire to die can be silenced and denied agency and choice. These approaches, I believe, might allow for engagement with long-standing practical and ethical questions relating to suicide in new and useful ways. There you go.
Thank you very much, Ian. And we're going to go straight to a comment from historian Georgina Larragee. And we'll have time for questions later on, but I'm going to read her response because she wasn't able to join us today, but she has prepared some remarks in response to your lecture. Georgina is the Glasnevin Trust Assistant Professor in Public History and Cultural Heritage at Trinity College Dublin. And I'm going to try and do justice to her comments with feelings of intense pressure now about speaking loudly and slowly enough. So let me know how I do. Here I go. In Ian Marsh's excellent paper, we get a real sense of a professional healthcare worker and academic engaged in thoughtful reflection about his practice in an effort to get to a root cause of something uncomfortable within the field in which he works. He quickly establishes the sense of community and situates his own thinking in the context of several scholars, activists, practitioners, and those with lived experience of suicide. He does this in order to pose a question about how the past impacts the present, in terms of the conceptualization, language, and practice around suicide. We're shown how that past feeds into modes and methods of suicide prevention and intervention. And finally, the paper concludes that histories of suicide have helped construct a form of discrimination against those who voice their suicidal feelings or who have attempted or committed suicide, suicidism. But what are those histories? Well, in writing this response to Dr. Marsh's paper, I've looked anew at the historiography that I'm familiar with in an effort to see how informed they and we are by contemporary and critical suicide studies. What efforts have been made to look to the past through the lens of contemporary thinking and ideas about suicide in much the same way that genetic science and epigenetics helps inform medical and demographic histories. Historians do not, as a rule, engage with contemporary thought or practice on their given topic. It can often seem overwhelming enough to cope with the literature for the period and historical works on the phenomenon under study, in addition to primary source material, without having to look in the direction of current professional practice around phenomena such as suicide, crime, or poverty. Yet some more radical and thoughtful historians are doing this elsewhere, particularly, I think, in the field of race, where critical race theory is becoming increasingly embedded within historical scholarship. Equally, public historians do engage in writing about contemporary problems as well as exploring it in the past. For example, Julia Late's work on sex trafficking. The 8-volume History of Suicide in England, 1650 to 1850, published in 2012 by Pickering and Chatto, demonstrates quite clearly the wide variety of meanings ascribed to suicide in the 2 centuries prior to its 19th century medicalization. Predominantly, suicide had been thought of as a bad death, in a division that aligned some deaths as good and others as bad. Suicide was bad because it was usually without hope of repentance. It was violent and very often a shock for the finder and the family and friends of the deceased. As it moved from being classed as a sin to a form of illness, the badness has not been washed away. Mental illness in general, and suicidal death in particular, are both viewed as taboo subjects. Our contemporary, largely secular Western world reflects the reality that medicalization pushed past legal, religious, and moral teachings around self-inflicted death. In the course of coroner's inquests in Britain and Ireland, as well as America, she says she's not sure about Holland, there were two options available to the jury who wanted to return a verdict of suicide. They could claim the deceased as insane, the wording could vary, or that they were felo de se, a felon of themselves, which meant they were sane. In the majority of cases, and from the 18th century, insanity was increasingly ascribed to those who killed themselves, with felo de se being reserved for a small minority of deaths. In addition to the medicalization of suicide in the 19th century, Durkheim in Belgium, Enrico Mosselli in Italy, James O'Dea in America, and others helped to establish what Dr. Marsh terms the social facts of suicide. Sociologists and medics alike connected suicide with broader social patterns and groups, who then are identified as having risk factors. But asking why those groups have risk factors is clearly a better question to ask. And I think that is the part of what Ian is proposing in applying a social justice lens to suicide studies. Nevertheless, the dominance of the idea of suicide as the result of individual pathology undermines the application of a social justice lens. Because not everyone who falls into an at-risk group kills themselves. Not everyone who lives in poverty or suffers from racial or homophobic discrimination, or for whom patriarchal and capitalist economic structures lead to a life unfulfilled, not all these people kill themselves, unfulfilled. And because they don't, it remains possible to attach blame not to the structures, but once again to an individual pathology. The key aspect about Ian's paper for me is the term social justice and the application of a social or political justice lens when thinking about suicide. No historical studies appear to use the term social justice, as far as I can tell. Nevertheless, historians of suicide, in echoing sociologist Emil Durkheim, have connected the individual with broader structures of state and society, looking at institutions like religion and marital status, and through subfields like social history and methodologies like microhistory. Historians such as Olive Anderson in the 1980s, Victor Bailey in the 1990s, early 2000s, and Diane Somerville Miller in the 2010s have attempted to recreate the social meaning of suicide through work which examines intersections of class, gender, race, and age. Possibly the most political, with a small p, work is that by Diane Somerville Miller, Aberration of Mind, Suicide and Suffering in the Civil War Era South, published in 2019. In exploring suicide within certain populations in the defeated states of the southern United States, Somerville Miller examined suicide within enslaved communities and amongst men and women facing economic ruin, as well as the relationship between military service, the nature of war, and suicide. As in most 19th century histories of suicide, the role of temporary insanity is significant. The majority of those who killed themselves were viewed by a coroner's juries as insane. Historical studies have reflected and perhaps contributed in part to the hierarchical responses to suicide. By focusing on the responses and records of those in authority, be it state, local, or medical authority, the pain of the suicidal is mediated not through the voice of the suicidal themselves, but often through officials who dealt with the dead body. Also present at inquests were doctors who had treated the deceased in their most recent illness, if they had attended a doctor, and family members, neighbors, and friends who had to explain their last days, hours, or moments. Historians have attempted to examine the lived experience of suicidality, but there is sometimes little to work with, partly because of the nature of the sources, though work by Ella Sabriani on suicide notes is attempting to address this. But I wonder if historians' reticence about the voice of the suicidal themselves has been in part because we arrive at the topic from a social and cultural context in which suicide continues to be viewed as pathological. Living as we do in an era of risk assessment, crisis management, and care plans, it's perhaps difficult to view it in any other way. Historians have recognized that the connection with temporary insanity was contingent rather than essential. It was a product of religious, moral, legal, and subsequently medical frameworks. In many ways, the coroner's inquest as a forum for medico-legal knowledge creation probably assisted in the establishment of professional psychiatry, or at least it created a public acceptance of doctors as mediators of knowledge about mental illness. But temporary insanity existed as a medico-legal verdict long before the psych professions or their widespread institutional settings came into existence. Verdicts at coroner's inquests were mediated through numerous non-medical individuals, including the coroner, the jurors, and the witnesses, who may or may not have included a doctor. When a doctor did testify in many cases, unless he was personally acquainted with the deceased, he very often only spoke to the physical condition of the body and the physical cause of death. The connection between insanity or individual pathology and suicide has shifted across time, but not all suicides in the past were thought to be caused by mental illness. There have been multiple instances when self-destruction was deployed as a tactic, drawing attention to political issues often beyond the control of the individuals who died. However, such deaths have tended to be viewed by historians as a minority action or behavior, outside the bounds of what is considered a typical suicide. Examples of this include Roman soldiers wishing to die with honor after defeat in battle, the suicides of French revolutionaries who faced the guillotine in the 1790s, the suicides of Irish revolutionaries who faced execution, and hunger strikers in India, Ireland, and elsewhere. Alongside those obviously politically motivated suicides, which occurred at a time of significant challenge to the political and governmental status quo, were those who killed themselves whilst crossing the Atlantic on slave ships, suicides among enslaved populations in Caribbean and American plantations, and suicide within various militaries. These I consider to be political suicides with a smaller p, related to the power of the individual within specific legal and social contexts. Historians have, I think, viewed suicides in those past political contexts as structurally motivated, but have failed in some instances to see less politically inflected suicides as also being structurally motivated. There is still a privileging of political history. It is part of the privileging of politics over the social and structural inequalities in everyday life, and this means that other small p suicides are not viewed in this context. Suicides like that of Emma Wilson, who drowned herself in Belfast in 1883 after her married lover told her to go home to her own people and bring their illegitimate child. At the end of the inquest, after the jury had returned an open verdict of found drowned, the coroner asked how far the provocation would have affected her mind. A juror declared to applause that there was no insanity about it. When I read Ian's paper, Connecting Suicide and Justice, this case came to my mind. The certainty for the jury that there was no insanity in Emma Wilson's mind when she drowned herself reveals that even within the constraints of the coroner's court, popular opinion and attempts at popular justice emerged very vocally and publicly. However, these ideas connecting justice, suicide, and insanity did not bubble up to challenge the hegemonic view that saw a connection between suicide and mental illness. We have no way of knowing why Emma Wilson drowned herself, but in understanding the shame if she returned to her own people, as well as the options available for a young single mother in 19th century Belfast, we can begin to see the shape of Emma's vision for herself and her future, and how absolutely hopeless and bereft she must have felt. As a historian working with cases like Emma's, it's a real privilege to respond to Dr. Marsh's paper because we get a real sense here of the value of history and understanding of the past and the significance of seeing individuals in their broader social and cultural contexts. Understanding historical context and contingency enables those working in the field today to open up space, as Ian says, in order to redirect some of the existing ideas and practices around suicide and suicide prevention. But equally, historians can benefit hugely from availing themselves of the work of critical suicide studies in order to approach historical cases and detect individual expressions of serious social pathologies. Taken to its most radical endpoint, critical suicide studies could be viewed as permitting suicide in cases that are thoughtfully and carefully considered within established parameters in the same way that euthanasia is permitted. However, Marsh does warn that suicidal subjectivities over time within unjust systems would continue, but be masked by approved processes of consent. The application of a social justice lens requires not only embedding lived experience into a shared vision for how to respond to suicidal ideation, but that the processes creating those responses must also be viewed through the lens of social and political justice. Dr. Marsh's paper reveals a paradigm shift within suicide studies that advances the vision of critical suicide studies, emerging alongside other movements within the health and public health arena, practices and campaigns like harm reduction within addiction studies and the disability rights movement. In working with people directly affected by the issue at hand, and through a justice and human rights lens, coercion, discrimination, and judgment are removed from the processes of working with sufferers. And while Dr. Marsh hasn't used this phrase, there are echoes in his paper that critical suicide studies is adopting a nothing about us without us vision, which has emerged from historical movements that espouse democratic values of inclusion, representation, and participation. In detailing the ontology of pathology, the critical history, the contingency of ideas about suicide in the past, the effects or truth effects of this, Marsh and others have developed a new field of inquiry predicated on disassembling historic ideas, practices, and language in order to impact current policy, prevention, and practices around this. In adopting a political or social justice lens, he provides food for thought for everyone working in the field of suicide studies. That was from Georgina Larragee. Round of applause for her. Would you like to reply now?
I will write to Georgina and say thank you. That's very generous. That's brilliant. I've learned from that. So.
All right, we'll have time for reflections on Ian's presentation and Georgina's comments after the next speaker. For now, I would like to welcome Chris Millard. Do you want to set up your presentation and I'll introduce you? Technical panic occurring. Shall I give you this in a minute? Just introduce you. All right, thank you. Moving swiftly along, our next speaker is Dr. Chris Millard, who is Senior Lecturer in the History of Medicine and Medical Humanities at the University of Sheffield, and he will be speaking on suicide, attempted suicide, and self-harm in 20th century Britain, historical, institutional, and conceptual confusion. Thank you, Chris.
Hello. Yes, the title has very slightly changed, but I want to really think about what historians are looking at when they are looking at evidence of suicide, attempted suicide, and self-harm. Because I think with that really close attention to the kinds of information, the kinds of data, but also the kinds of institutional structures that produce that data, is the only way we can really understand what we might responsibly be able to say about suicide, suicidal behavior in the past. We don't have access to human beings. We have access to documents and records. And I think that's really important to keep in our minds. So a little bit of context. I'm a historian of psychiatry, and my principal set of sources are medical scholarly journals, Anglophone, mostly Britain, but a little bit USA, Canada, and Australia. And I've looked at the category of what was called deliberate self-cutting in American and British psychiatric literature. And I did a PhD on attempted suicide, self-poisoning, and what was called parasuicide, which I'll get to in a bit. And so what I want that to sort of do, the work I want this context to do for this talk, is to show that I'm interested in categories, diagnostic categories, labels, and their relationship to institutions. Because what we are able to know, what we are able to find out about the past has to be intimately connected to these structures, these institutions that produce the information. And sometimes I do think we forget this. I don't think that this is a surprise to anybody, but sometimes when we write about suicide in the past, we forget about the specificity and the partiality of the information that we have. And I think that I want us to really work through and appreciate the consequences of this partiality when talking about suicide, self-harm, and attempted suicide. So, I'm going to start talking about classifying suicidal behavior in history. Suicidal behavior is this sort of blanket term that covers an awful lot of different behaviors and different ideas of intention. And I'm going to talk about how many of the ways that we understand suicidal behavior either centers on the intent, what does that person mean to do, and then also on what they are doing, what kind of thing is it that this person is doing. And I think that there is a really interesting dynamic when people try to get away from intent and focus on behavior, they actually end up circling back round to intent over and over again. And I think that tells us something quite important about the nature of suicide and the nature of suicide in the past. And I then want to say, what would happen if we instead focused on outcome? What if we instead focused on whether a person survives or dies? Because what that does is that shows us institutional difference. Because people who survive end up either at emergency departments, in hospitals, or they don't come to medical attention at all. And people who die end up at very, very different places. They end up being talked about in coroner's courts. Those institutions are so different that I'm not sure it is responsible to combine attempted suicide and suicide when the information comes to us from such different places. So, what are we classifying? What are we investigating? I think these questions are really central, and we don't often think too much about them. When we think about suicidal behavior, we're talking about behavior that looks to us like suicide, but might not have the intent to die. That's one of the things that self-harm really shows us. The emergence of self-harm, or the sort of contemporary object of self-harm, is only really emerging in the 1960s in North American psychiatry. You can project it further and further back if you like. My personal opinion is that our contemporary idea of what self-harm is comes from the 1960s. And then we think about, well, whose opinions matter in these classifications and these investigations? I work very much on medical journals, and that they're written in a very authoritative, very detached way. And I think what I'm interested in is how people have used classifications. I'm not interested in whether they're right or wrong. actually, and I'm not really interested in trying to adjudicate between them. I'm interested in why people use certain classifications in certain contexts. What work do these classifications do? What do they allow people to see, but what do they close off? How is our vision structured by these categories, by these classifications? And at the center of this is a contextual understanding of the decisions that historical actors make. And whether these are people trying to assess, trying to treat, trying to intervene, or whether they are the people who are either trying to end their life or trying to do something maybe a little bit different, but with the symbolism of suicide. So, if we split suicidal behavior off into sort of 3 chunks, we've got completed suicide, attempted suicide, and self-harm. And if we think about this in terms of intent in a very sort of standard way, suicide is a positive intent to kill oneself, to end one's life. Attempted suicide is actually quite ambiguous. For some, it might be an attempt, a positive intent to end one's life gone wrong. But for others, it might be read as a kind of communication, a kind of expression of distress, or an expression that one doesn't care whether or not one lives or dies, a sort of abdication and a risk take. And so there isn't a settled intent either way, and then self-harm is behavior that seems to either clinicians or the practitioner to be harmful, but is not aimed at ending life. So all of these definitions, they circle around intention. What does this person intend? And often one of the narratives around self-harm, and especially self-cutting, is this positive intent to regulate emotional tension or emotional turmoil instead of trying to end life. And it's been mistaken, or it was mistaken in the 1950s and 1960s in Britain. It was mistaken as somebody trying to end their life when actually what they were trying to do was to regulate their emotional tension by cutting. And there are also these other terms that clinicians sometimes use. Parasuicide was coined in 1969 by a man called Norman Kreitman, and he wanted to dig into this idea of intent and say, well, here is some behavior that looks like suicide. For him, the archetypal parasuicidal behavior was a small overdose. So an overdose of medication, say 20 or 30 aspirin. Something that he knew as a clinician wasn't seriously life-threatening, but was clearly thought to be suicidal by the person doing it. And that symbolism of suicide was really important in trying to bring help from the environment. So this intent that it looks like suicide, but it is not. Pseudocide was another term proposed for the same phenomenon, and propecia, which is derived from the Greek word for rashness, the idea that these people are impulsive and they impulsively do something in order to either release tension or to get reactions from their environment. So there is a lot of terminological innovation in the 1960s in Britain, which says to me there is something happening that people don't quite understand, and so they are forging new terms to try and describe it more accurately. And of course, the reason why we think so much about intent when we think about suicide is that intent is so central to the legal system. For a huge number of crimes, for example, you need intent to be there. You have to establish intent to do harm, for example. Now, psychiatry and the legal system are intertwined, going back through hundreds and hundreds of years. And so here we have a legal context. In England and Wales, suicide and attempted suicide are both criminal offences up until 1961. Suicide is a felony, which means it is against the law for you not to report it. And attempted suicide is a misdemeanor, which means that if you see someone doing it, you would not be breaking the law were you to fail to report it. Okay? And this law change happens in 1961 after some lobbying by psychiatrists and by people of the church. The Church of England writes a wonderful booklet called Ought Suicide to be a Crime in 1961 and says, basically, we do not think that the Anglican Church and the Anglican congregation would think it a problem were we to decriminalize suicide. And so there was a real stepping back, a conscious stepping back of religious authorities from this idea of suicide. There's so much going on here. And for attempted suicide, I've put 1959 up there because that's the date of the passage of the Mental Health Act 1959, which means that any general hospital can treat a psychiatric problem. Prior to that, if you present at a general hospital in England with what is seen to be a psychological problem, you can only be treated there under very, very specific circumstances and for no more than 17 days. After those 17 days are up, you're either transferred to the asylum, to the psychiatric hospital, or you're sent home. So there is an enormous set of barriers at psychiatric treatment at general hospitals. And this is removed in 1959. And one of the things, of course, about attempted suicide is that it has a very physical aspect to it. If one has slashed one's throat or one's wrist or taken an overdose, there is a physical problem to be dealt with as well as then a psychological one. But the physical one predominates. You don't send somebody who's taken 50 aspirin to have a psychiatric interview until you've treated them physically. So there is a really important crossover and conflict here between a regime of mental health care and a regime of physical health care. And this, again, is changing. And one of the things about intent is that you can get the wrong outcome, is what I put up there. You can get the wrong outcome. And what I mean by this is somebody can intend very seriously and very genuinely to end their life, but not be able to do it. If you take 500 vitamin C tablets intending to end your life, it's not going to have that effect. But the intent was there. And in the same way, somebody can attempt to elicit help from their environment, and it can go wrong, and they can cut themselves more deeply than they intend, and they can end up dying when that wasn't their intention. So intent is really, really complicated, and I don't think it gives us the key to understanding what we can say about suicide in the past. It's so ambiguous, it's so difficult to get a handle on. And so Erwin Stengel was a psychiatrist in Britain in the 1950s who began to do work on what he called attempted suicide. And the confusing thing about Stengel is that for him, the term attempted suicide does not mean that these people are attempting suicide, right? This really confused me. His version of attempted suicide is that people who are taking small overdoses are in fact searching for some kind of connection with their social circle, what was called a cry for help. And now that term has a very pejorative and very sort of attention-seeking sense to it. For Stengel, that wasn't pejorative. That was something that needed to be listened to. But he called it attempted suicide, when he was also very clear that suicide, the ending of life, was absolutely not what people were actually attempting. And so what Neil Kessel did about 10 years later is to rename this self-poisoning. And he does this specifically because the vast majority of people he sees are people who've taken overdoses, and he wants to back away from intent. He wants to say, let me just describe the behavior. and the behavior is self-poisoning. And whether it is aimed at death or whether it is aimed at a cry for help, I'm trying not to say that. I'm trying to describe the behavior. But then the way he investigates this is to get psychiatric social workers to do home visits for the people who come into his poisoning unit, and they go and they assess the home environment, and they look at the relationship history, and they see, is the husband of this young girl an alcoholic? Is this why this person is behaving like this? So it circles back to intent. It's what is the reason for this person doing this? And so even when people try and focus upon behavior, and they try and sort of keep intent bracketed away, they're always circling back round to it. And with self-harm, there is this attempt to simply describe what is going on with terms like self-cutting, wrist slashing, delicate self-cutting, and wrist cutting. Some of those terms extremely gendered. And there are psychodynamic psychotherapists who are very interested in the phenomenon of young women in psychiatric inpatient institutions who cut themselves and produce blood. And for many of these psychiatrists, this is sort of vicarious menstruation, or it's something psychosexual. It's an incredibly gendered phenomenon here. But again, they always circle back round to intent. What is happening? But instead, I do want to try and argue that we need to focus instead on outcome. Because whilst there is that overlap when somebody might intend something different to what actually ends up happening, there is a sense that when we talk about suicide, we are talking about a set of practices with long-established statistical regularities. We're going back 200 years, potentially. And there is a whole legal system that kicks in around reporting of and disposal of bodies. That means that there is an enormous amount of focused attention on somebody who has completed suicide and ended their life. And as I think Bert was saying earlier, look, people don't record attempted suicides. It's patchwork, it's piecemeal, it's done for a particular hospital, it's done for a particular district, it might be done for a few years for a particular city, because it's so difficult to pick people up and to classify them. And so when people sort of fold suicide and attempted suicide together, you're mixing two things that are fundamentally different in the data that we've got. Even if intellectually, conceptually, we might say, well, of course there's an overlap here. Of course these are the same things or the same kinds of things. And I think what I want to argue is that when we're talking about this historically, they are not the same kinds of things, because they are found in such different institutions and produced through such different practices. I've sort of covered that slide. Just to say, the term self-harm is really interesting here. So self-harm to most contemporary audiences means, or sort of is archetypally self-cutting. Cutting on the forearms, cutting at the legs, sometimes self-burning. The original term in English, deliberate self-harm, coined in the mid-1970s, was actually used to describe hospital-presenting populations of 90 to 95% overdoses and only 5 or 10% people self-cutting. And so even the terms that we're using to try and explain intention, they shift radically very, very quickly. And that's another reason why I think for historians to focus on intent is just so difficult and dangerous. So, as I hope I've been sort of clear, I'm much more interested in how knowledge about these behaviors gets produced, what are the constraints under which it is produced, than I am about sort of trying to classify this or that person in the past, or to have an argument about suicide statistics or attempted suicide statistics. How are people classified? What is the point? What is the object of this classification? Rather than saying, well, actually, this person should have gone in this box and that person should have gone in that box. And I think that if we can focus on institutions, we're much closer to something that reflects the partiality, the fragmentary nature of the documents that we have. So what? Who cares? As two questions much favoured by one of my PhD examiners, which was an interesting experience. I don't think that we should forget about behaviour totally. You know, the reason that self-poisoners, for example, predominate at accident and emergency departments over people who cut themselves is because, well, there is much less knowledge about what a safe overdose is than there is about what certain cuts look like if they need medical intervention. So if someone's taken 15, 20 paracetamol, they're much more likely to be taken to A&E just to be checked out than somebody who has made a few cuts on their arm. That can be treated at home, that can be treated with first aid. That doesn't actually need to come to a medical professional. So there are clear reasons why certain behaviours predominate in certain places. But just to sort of wrap this up, I think when we combine different kinds of information, when we combine sort of coroner's court records with accident and emergency studies, it is possible to do interesting things. But I think it's also possible to forget the fundamental difference between the kinds of data that are produced in a legal context where people can be compelled to appear and speak about a particular death in a coroner's court, compared to an extremely brief psychiatric assessment by a liaison psychiatrist who's rushed off their feet and they get marked as a tick in a box. And I do think that historians have been particularly what's the right word? I was going to say callous, and that actually is too much. Certainly careless at combining suicide, self-harm, and attempted suicide together. The idea, for example, that men commit suicide more than women, but women self-harm more than men. If we combine these rates together, we'll get something that will make sense. And I don't think that that is actually particularly robust as a historical method. And I just want to finish then by sort of repeating myself for one final time, that we must pay attention to the institutional and practical ways that data that comes to us as historians. If we pay attention to how it's produced, we'll be in a much better position to think about what we might be able to say about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Would you like to take a seat at the front for the Q&A? And Ian, would you like to come back and join us?
I'll get you a different microphone.
Yeah, I can't answer for Georgina, but I can maybe draw some comments. Do we have comments or questions from the floor first? Yeah.
To the last speaker, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. Yeah, I was thinking during your talk, because we commonly see attempters as one group. The difference between suicide and suicide attempt is one is fatal and the other is non-fatal, but it's one group of attempters. So I was curious how you think about that. And the other thing is that we also say that suicide is not really an intention to die or intention to kill oneself, but more they have a problem which is so big that they don't see another solution. So the intention not really to kill themselves. So I was also, I'm wondering how you think about this.
No, sure. Thank you. I think with that second sort of comment, legally, when suicide is a crime, it absolutely has to be an intent to kill oneself, and I think this is a conflict between the clinical idea of what, or the psychosocial idea of what a suicide might be or might mean, and that legal definition. You know, suicide is a very heavily legalized term. I would say it's even more legal than medical. And that's where that intent sort of comes in. And I think that absolutely now, suicide can be seen as a response to a problem that is insoluble or thought to be unsolvable. But it exists in that sort of legal framework that prioritizes intent, even if we don't quite realize it. I think the Judith Butler quotation that Ian had up was actually really useful. When you sort of when you have a space, and the space in which suicide sits, it carries that idea of intent with it, even if we don't want it, even if we would rather not have it, and even if we think it's inappropriate. I think it is still there. With the first question, I think, obviously, you're absolutely right. Attempters don't die, and people who commit suicide do. But that is a tautological definition. That tells us nothing about intent or behaviour, right? Because there is a sense in which that can be down to complete chance, or that can be down to a mistake. And so I think, and it puzzles me, and I'm trying to sort of think it through, and I don't think I have an answer, but I do think that more focus on the practicalities of attempting suicide and suicide is really helpful.
Thank you. I see another question over here.
Thank you very much. Two incredibly interesting and stimulating papers. Thank you. I suppose I had a question for Ian, really, and I'd be interested in, I mean, I'm totally with you about the sort of depoliticizing nature of approaches to suicide, and by sort of reducing it to an individual mental health problem, then it sort of abdicates responsibility from institutions, from government, from universities, from workplaces, because if it's an individual mental health problem, then the individual has to help him or herself. I'd be interested in your response to, I think one of those depoliticizing strategies is the whole well-being agenda. But I'm also conscious that we can be very cynical, and that therapeutical approaches like well-being can be helpful. So the first thing, what do you think of that sort of well-being agenda? But also the Zero Suicide Alliance. You talked about at the end of your presentation about suicide prevention, and you also mentioned pro-suicide forums. So what I'd also be interested in what you think about the Zero Suicide Alliance. So those two. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. The first question, well-being. I think it makes me think that, if I'm thinking academically, it makes me think of that the idea of responsibilization, how systemic problems come to be read as individual problems that we fix ourselves, which is a kind of symptom of a kind of capitalist, individualist kind of approach to mental health problems. But it also makes me think, part of my job is running a Suicide Safer Universities project across a number of universities. And absolutely, when and so I'm seconded to student support within a university, so I work within there. And absolutely, within the systems or the options that are available for us, yeah, absolutely, we run stress-less stuff around exam time. We got a load of money for post-COVID mental health recovery from the council. So we instigate a lot of kind of activities and well-being. It's a whole well-being agenda. Our team is student well-being, and you can't knock that really. And the student deaths by suicide that I've experienced secondhand, but within the university where I work, are devastating. It's just awful and heart-rending. And then you think, well, if they only got support, or if only they'd found some ways to get support. So on a kind of human, everyday level, I think that well-being agenda is fine, but the critique of it, I think, is also valid, that it does, as you said very articulately, you know, kind of shifts responsibility away from that. And I think that's a tension you often find is that you've got to work within the systems that are available for you, whilst also working to try and change those systems. But it's really difficult and quite hard, and you don't want to kind of throw out everything at one point just because you're ideologically opposed to it. And I've forgotten the second question. The zero suicide. Well, the zero suicide is really interesting because the question I ask is who are they talking to? Because it's very strident, and you know, one death by suicide is one too many. You can't disagree with that. But I wonder who their audience is. And when I look online for the pro-choice suicide forums, when people who have, Chris will tell me off for talking about intent again, but I think, you know, a kind of high degree of suicidal intent. And it's a space that isn't monitored by researchers. It isn't set up by research. It isn't set up by psychiatrists. It's suicidal people talking to themselves. What comes across is a real commitment to the idea of choice and a real resentment and opposition to prevention as an idea. And that raises really fundamental questions again about what we're doing when we talk about suicide prevention, who we're talking to, who our audience is, and what we're hoping to achieve. Because I think if your target audience, if you treat them as a target, which is problematic in itself, but your target audience have fundamentally rejected the stance that you're taking up, then who are the Zero Suicide Alliance talking to? And they're talking to policymakers, and they're talking to other bereaved people, which is all fine. I have no problem with that. But the question about who your audience is a question about effectiveness. And also ethics, I think, but the effectiveness definitely, because if your starting point, to give an example, online people will talk about do-gooders, people will talk about its prevention as people as not understanding what their experience, people will talk about it as oppressive, they talk about it as naive, and they talk about it as intrusive. So you have almost these parallel worlds of a mainstream kind of prevention, or you know, say zero suicide, and actually what we could call the lived experience of people, which I do believe have quite high intent, because you know lots of people die from those forums empirically. So I think the question for zero suicide isn't that we all want to prevent suicide and we're on board with that. But are we saying the right things? And it was going back to what I was saying earlier about help seeking. You know, like if our model of suicide prevention is help seeking, that's well and good. But maybe we should question that is the only model, or that model is completely effective. If we can see that actually many people have sought help, haven't found it useful, have got worn out by help, or found a help that didn't address the issues they really wanted to address, or didn't resonate with them, and then go on to die by suicide. So we have a logic, you know, to prevention. It often makes sense, but I think there's some difficult questions to ask about whether we're reaching the right people and saying the right things to the right people.
Thank you. I see two more questions on the other side of the room.
Sorry, I was going to say, Sarah really asked one version of my question, so, and Ian answered. So
Okay,
please.
I'll move on.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, my question's for Ian as well. It kind of just struck me when you were talking about the kind of individualization and pathologization of suicide that we have at the moment, which I completely agree with. But how do you think that tracks with the idea of suicidology being so influenced by Durkheim, which was very much it's a social fact. It's not entirely individualized. So there seems to be a conflict there of it, how it's developed into the kind of like individualization kind of thesis.
Yeah, and what I think is that the predominant, it's just about spaces, and I think that what I often say is you know, if you start telling people you're suicidal, where do you end up? You don't end up talking to a sociologist, you end up talking to a doctor, and you end up probably, if you keep telling a doctor, you end up with a psychiatrist, and if you keep telling a psychiatrist, you'll end up probably in a mental health ward. So I think there's that practical aspect to it. I also think, and I've talked to a few different sociologists, and there's some sociologists doing some brilliant work that isn't just about kind of social facts about suicide, but it does have that. That's why I talk about it as a kind of political justice or political kind of response to suicide, because I think you can go certain distance with a social determinants of health approach, and it will drop inequalities. But I think in terms, I'm not always sure that's effective. I think we know that and have known that since Durkheim, probably before and certainly afterwards. And sociologists have been saying it for a long time. So we know about inequality, but how come it doesn't change? How come that isn't at the forefront of kind of prevention issues? And so I think that's why it becomes a political rather than a social facts or a sociological kind of issue.
Can I just respond as well? I think that's part of that question is also around who Durkheim was dealing with, which is people who had died and were basically stats. He went around collecting stats from various coroner's offices in France. But when you're talking about intervention, that whole mode of intervention, you don't intervene on people who have already died. They're always alive, and so there you've got that huge division there. So Durkheim talks about suicide as a social fact in a completely different context than the interventionists who are always intervening on people who are actually at this point still alive. And that, I think, not to drag everything around back to that point I was shouting about, but I do think that is an important difference between those two conversations about suicide.
Other questions or comments in the room? I have one maybe to ask, is there a bit of a tension between the take that each of you have presented today? Because presumably part of the emphasis on intent is to then treat or intervene or prevent. So what do you think about, both of you, about can you treat things that you don't know the cause of? Does it run the risk of depoliticizing to move away from intent and getting away from the model that Ian was proposing? Are you at war, basically, or not?
I mean, just a very brief response. I absolutely think you can treat things that you don't understand the cause of. I think, treatment for schizophrenia, right? We don't know what causes schizophrenia. I think treatment is a very sort of heterogeneous assemblage of things you might do or you might say to somebody, and I think that you don't need to know very much about something in order to try and help. And I think that's really true around suicidality, actually, that you don't have to know an enormous amount about it to be able to do a bit of help. But the problem, I think, then comes, and this is where I think Ian and I agree, is that if you keep doing that, you will miss some of the negatives, you will miss some of the consequences of what you're doing. And so with the individualization, with the depoliticization, it's all very well and absolutely right to be compassionate to an individual and to completely stand behind that, I think, as Ian was saying. But there are other consequences to that individual approach, and I think that's really important to be able to hold together with the idea that we also should be doing this.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's a good question. What actually Chris's talk and Georgina's response actually made me think of is where do we draw our knowledge from to understand suicide? And Chris has helped with that, and Georgina's had. Because one of the things, again, that struck me, that's changed my thinking a lot, reading online pro-choice forums, is that these are probably people that don't engage in research, and probably with a psychological autopsy or died by suicide, the stuff they talk about online probably wouldn't come up from family and friends. There's a space there where people are talking about things in a way that I don't think would become public, but curiously is public through the forums. So, I think intent is really interesting, because I think when you're sitting in A&E and you're tired and you're probably not well if you've harmed yourself, and a psychiatrist comes up to you or a liaison nurse and asks you why you did it, you'll probably come up with a story that gets you off the hook in some way. You'll probably say something that makes it as easy as possible for you to go on and not have further bad things happen to you. So I think sometimes people talk about it was impulsive, but I think impulsive is sometimes a story that people tell in order to make the researcher go away, or make the nurse go away, or the doctor go away. So sometimes our sources of knowledge to understand are based on actually fairly flaky kind of information. But the other thing about intent, very quickly, because I know people want to go home, but it is around ambivalence and ambiguity, what you were talking about. And I used to believe that, and I do up to a point. But you look at online forums, the ambiguity is an ambivalence is minimal, what I find. And what people are actually ambiguous about, or kind of that, is not about wanting to die, but not about wanting to experience pain and suffering and possibly survive. So and the ambivalence often is expressed in terms of the survival instinct. about people find it really, really hard to actually overcome. So often they're expressing a really, what you say, a high intent to die and a really strong desire to die. And what stopped them is that there's no easy way, that it's actually whatever methods you take. So I think the ambivalence is actually around overcoming that fear of pain and death. And I've been really struck by that, whereas I used to be with Ed Schneidman, that, you know, people actually want things to get better. I think for some of the people I've been talking about, which might be that kind of think of as kind of post-help seeking, have gone through all our services, have rung helplines, gone through mental health services, have got support from family and friends, and things haven't got better and still want to die. The ambivalence is much less, and I think I have a feeling, and I can't prove it, that they are the ones that go on to complete suicide in much more than we acknowledge. And the people that are more ambivalent and still open to help seeking tends to be the ones we end up talking to and gather our information about suicide and attempts at suicide around.
Thank you very much. It sounds like we have a lot more to dive into on that issue. So we'll be back here tomorrow morning at 9 for coffee and registration. And the first session starts at 9:30. But with that, I'd like to thank once again all of our speakers for a great session.